Welcome to our last session of the day, Authentic Leadership When You Are the Only One in the Room. We know that as a Hispanic executive, you've likely been in the room where you're the only Latinx leader. Today, we'll discuss practices for embracing authenticity and being true to your identity in a leadership capacity. Before we start, I'd like to give a special thanks to our sponsor, Toyota. Please enjoy this video highlighting Toyota's dedication to diversity.
We are the strong, the tenacious and compassionate members of diverse communities. We don't let others define us. We remember our roots, while bravely writing the script for our own future. We have an undeniable zest for life and a heart that beats with resounding determination. Whether it's supporting our Toyota team members, embracing the richness of their cultural diversity, or partnering with them to drive business decisions, or serving the community, collaborating with grassroots and national organizations. Together, we're improving access to opportunities where members of every generation can thrive. We celebrate you. When we come together, we can create limitless possibilities for all. Vayamos juntos.
Thank you again to Toyota for your partnership with HACR and dedication to Hispanic inclusion. Now here to guide today's discussion is HACR President and CEO, Sid Wilson. Welcome, Sid.
Good afternoon for everyone who is on the East, Central, or Mountain Time. I guess it's still good morning if you're on the West Coast. But this is our final session of the day, the first of our 2 days session, and we certainly encourage everyone to make sure you come back tomorrow. But this one is a topic that we hear so frequently, and even today, a lot of Q&A questions were around this theme of authenticity. And so that's why this is such an important topic called authentic leadership when you're the only one in the room. And how many of us have been the only person in the room? And so we're going to have a dialogue with three very distinguished leaders who we're going to talk about their experiences being the only one in the room. Because as you know, the higher you go up within the corporate ladder, the greater the likelihood that you may be the only person who's Latino in the room, or person of color in the room, or maybe only woman in the room. And while we know there's a long way to go to make sure that we get full authenticity in terms of diversity, we're still going to be in those situations. So we have a discussion. So I want to introduce our panelists. First, I want to introduce Isaura Gaeta. She is the Vice President of Security Research for the Product Assurance and Security Division for Intel Corporation. Welcome, Isaura. All right. And then next we have Marisol Rubecindo. She is the Chief of Staff for the General Counsel's Office at JPMorgan Chase & Company. Marisol, bienvenido. Welcome to the panel.
Gracias, Ed.
And last but not least, Michael Camuñez. He is the President and CEO for Monarch Global Strategies. But I also just want to have a point of personal privilege. Michael is also, I call the Honorable Michael Camuñez, because he is also the former Assistant Secretary for Market Access at the U.S. Department of Commerce under the Obama administration. So someone that knows a lot about just being very global. So please welcome Michael Camuñez to the panel.
Good morning.
Great. So let's first start with this question, and this is a question that I know that I experience it and many others experience it. Can you talk about how you react when you walk into a meeting and you look around the room and there's no one else that looks like you or even shares any commonalities, whether it's racial, cultural, gender, or other commonalities from us as underrepresented communities. Talk about how you react and what's that feeling like when you walk into this room and you're looking around. It's like there's just no one else that looks like me. We'll start with you, Michael.
Okay.
Right.
Well, thank you. First of all, good morning, everybody. It's great to be with you, and I hope it's been a successful and productive conference. First of all, just some framing. I mean, I think it's important to understand where I approach this question from. Not only do I run my own company, but I have the privilege of serving as an independent director and a trustee for two publicly traded companies, the Edison International, which is a Fortune 250 power company out in California, and as well as the Capital Group American Funds, which is the third largest mutual fund company in the world with about $1.7 trillion of assets under management. I also serve on the board of trustees at the Packard Foundation at Stanford University and of several other organizations. And I think those collective experiences have given me plenty of opportunity to be the only one in the room. I will say, just as a general matter, that it's interesting to me that I have had the privilege, I guess I would say, of never having felt terribly self-conscious in the past about being the only one in the room. I guess I got used to it from a very young age, from the time I left college and took my first job in Washington and sort of began building my career and eventually going to law school and becoming a lawyer and eventually a partner in a global law firm. It was just kind of commonplace. But I will say that since the George Floyd episode, and since all of this renewed consciousness around race and race discrimination and systemic discrimination generally, I will say it affected me in a very interesting way, and to the point that I do feel I find myself taking note more often. I think the most important thing from my perspective that I've learned is, and it sounds cliche, and I hate these conferences when you just hear cliche advice, but the title says it all. You've got to learn to be comfortable in your own skin and to just find your authentic voice. I find that I have a lot of internal dialogue, a lot of self-talk in my own head, where I find myself constantly reminding myself, whether it's on the Stanford Board of Trustees or at the Packard Foundation, where we're giving away, hundreds of millions of dollars a year, or any place else, especially in the corporate board setting, I'm not there as window dressing. I'm there for a reason. And I really believe it is important, to the best of my ability, to try to bring my lived experience, which is a different way of describing authenticity. I try to bring my lived experience to the discussion. If it's at Edison and we're talking about, the impacts of various corporate actions on our community, or what we're doing in the community, most of our ratepayers are working class in Southern California Latinos. And I try to bring that experience. I have had the lived experience of growing up poor. And I remember sitting down at the kitchen table with my mom, helping her balance her checkbook and trying to figure out, we're going to only pay half the PG&E bill or the utility bill so that we could have some money left over for groceries or something. And I know what it's like to have that. And I don't hesitate to bring those experiences up and to share them. I would just say that I think in all things in life, there's a balance to everything. And I think that to retain your effectiveness, because I think one risk that we run in a corporate setting especially, is we don't want to be stereotyped or marginalized. And so I try very hard to pick and choose when and where and on what issues I'm going to raise my voice, so that I'm not constantly sounding off about everything that I could possibly, make a point on. And I try to kind of conserve my voice in a way so that when I do speak, it's impactful and authentic, and people can sense, I think, the authenticity and the lived experience. And I don't hesitate to reference my own lived experience, but I pick and choose my battles, and I don't, even though I feel that I'm there somewhat in a representative capacity, I don't necessarily feel that I have to take on every single issue. I don't have to, fall on every sword. And I think that's part of the judgment and the wisdom that comes from experience and from being around, because I think one thing in the board setting or at the C-suite, as many of you know who may be C-suite executives, you have to preserve your efficacy, your power. And if you're constantly sounding off on everything, if you're championing every cause that might affect people of color, you may lose some of that effectiveness. So I think not being afraid to speak with from your lived experience and with your authentic voice, but also knowing what's important, because not everything is equally important.
Thank you, Michael. Marisol, what are your thoughts?
So it's interesting because I was thinking about the question, right? How do you react? And at some point you just become numb. I think, similar to Michael, you go through college and you go through law school and you go through all these corporate settings and you're so used to being the only person in the room that it actually takes me a minute to actually realize that now. So that's a privilege, I will say, because it does take some getting used to. But I think similar to what Michael said, right? Like I really make a focus on what's important and bringing my voice and how do I bring my perspective? Is it through storytelling? Is it engaging directly on an issue? And it really just depends on the audience. Like I like to think of my style of communication to be a little bit like salsa dancing. You kind of move and pivot accordingly to the audience that you're engaged in. And so I actually just try to show up as me as often as I can. And as the more senior you get, I think the more opportunity you have to do that. But if I were to think back to my younger, more junior self, what I would say is just show up authentically all the time. And that's what I actually try to do now because I want to role model that behavior for the junior folks around the room.
Thank you so much, Marisol. That's great. Isaura.
Yes, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you very much for inviting me here today. As I'm reflecting on this question, I think because of my background, the profession that I've chosen, it's something that I get reminded of every day. So I'm an electrical engineer by training. And since the very beginning of my career as a woman in electrical engineering and semiconductor, the industry, I pretty much my entire professional life have experiences where I'm the only one in the room or the first woman to have become a group leader or a manager or running a semiconductor plant. And so it's something that I experience almost every day. I didn't expect that though. When I was in college, I think I was living in a bubble. And due to sort of a nice mix of students who are very active, a very strong Latino group that I participated in at the engineering level. When I hit industry, when I graduated, I fully expected, I'm ready to go in and take charge. And I was actually surprised when people started asking questions about my background, the courses I had taken, my preparation. And so that feeling of you need to establish yourself in the room. People see the questions you ask, they learn about your credentials, and then it's like, oh, okay, she belongs in this room. But it still happens occasionally. I think in some settings, in leadership settings, sometimes, if I'm with a male colleague and even the male colleague could be reporting to me, I'll see people direct questions to him because they don't assume that a female is the leader of that team. And so, just redirecting the questions, answering. Luckily, my colleague will say, I think you need to hear from my boss on that question. But having the confidence of, okay, I have all my credentials. I've done all the training to justify that I am in this position and I know what I'm talking about. And then kind of like what Marisol said is just go for it. Just lean in. Because, people will try to take you off your game by asking some questions and kind of making you, momentarily have that imposter syndrome. But just going past that and starting to just take ownership of your place in the room is what I've been doing.
Hey Sid, can I add to that? Because I think
Yes,
Isaura said something that was really important, that I believe strongly in. I do think that there are times when there are these dynamics, and regrettably, I would say I see them personally playing out more along gender lines than ethnicity in my experience watching dynamics in the boardroom, consistent with what Isaura was describing. But she said something really important also, which I think is really important. I got some very good advice when I was a young lawyer at my former law firm from a mentor that I respected immensely, who was white, but who was very invested in my career. And his advice to me was, get your sea legs under you first. Like, you have a lot of promise and a lot of talent, but get your sea legs under you and establish, in this case, as a lawyer, he was talking to me, establish your bona fides as a lawyer. And his message to me was essentially that once people really come to see and appreciate your professional abilities, not that everything else goes away, because let's be honest, it never fully goes away, but it makes a huge difference. And I want to say this, especially to the extent there are young people in the audience that are in the earlier stages of their career. I think sometimes we do let that imposter voice in our heads predominate. And sometimes we do go into situations where we feel self-conscious, like maybe we don't belong. I certainly have felt that. And I felt that at various stages at the youngest parts. When I first got into my, college, I was like, I don't belong here. But I think that it's really important to work on that inner voice and to establish yourself in the first instance around your strengths and around your core competence, because that will, once you kind of earn people's respect as a competent, successful professional, somebody who knows what they're talking about and knows what they're doing, it gives you political capital, I think, to then speak out on other issues. If you come in and sort of only, make your voice heard around issues related to diversity, this is just my personal opinion, I think it's easier to fall into the trap of being pigeonholed. And I think that can work against you in terms of your overall effectiveness in the C-suite or at the board level. So I think really focusing on I forget, Isaura, how you characterize it, but establishing your credentials, or establishing, and I'm not talking about, credentials as in where you went to school, but I mean your competence, your core professionalism, that you're a good engineer, that you know what you're talking about. I think that really goes a long way to helping to open and overcome other kinds of barriers related to gender and race and other things. They still exist, but I think that's an important point that Isaura's made.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and this I think is going to, I think, segue into my next question, and I'll say this as well, is that I serve on a board myself, and I'm the only person in the room as well. So it's a common thing that happens not only at the board level, but of course even in company meetings, and so this brings me to a question that often happens, and this kind of builds a little bit of what you were saying about the imposter syndrome. But how do you sometimes? We've gotten feedback that from attendees who say that they sometimes feel this sense that they need to just adapt to the existing culture, where in that meeting or those meetings where they may be the only ones in the room, and it almost feels like assimilation. Whereas, how do you bring that comfort level to just just acculturate and or even declare yourself in these meetings in a way without feeling like you're being pigeonholed, as Michael mentioned. I think so that way, as Isaura mentioned, you're really bringing your credentials. But how do you do this? I'll go to Marisol first, and then I'll go to Marisol, and then Isaura, and then Michael.
Yeah, and so for me, it's interesting because had you asked, sort of, the assimilation point is really interesting to me. When I started at JPMorgan 12 years ago, I think that's all really I was focused on, is keeping my head down and just doing the work, and to Michael's point, right, letting the work speak for me. instead of me speaking for me, because I think that is how you prove your credentials and you establish yourself. I think that as I've gotten more senior and I've gotten more comfortable, you start evolving and you start being more conscious about what things you want to bring forth and what conversations you're going to have. And so, look, I think, again, sort of back to, telling my junior self, I don't regret the assimilation point piece of it, because it did take me a little bit to get really comfortable and confident and get my sea legs and really work through that. But over time, I have learned that I bring value. And they are as benefiting from me as I am from the positions that I'm in. And so I bring that, and I sort of let that guide myself. And I sort of shed that whole like pretend and sort of imposter syndrome, which every once in a while still comes into play. But I think the majority of the time I'm showing up fully, because again, I want to make sure that I am giving myself and others the voice, and bringing those perspectives. And so it takes some time, and I think the fact that I did put in the work helps, to then be able to sort of just show up and bring, all of me ish. There's still some pieces that I keep hidden.
My experience is very similar to yours, Marisol, in that initially I tried to fit in with, being one of the guys. And so I was very conscious about, I dressed very professionally, but it was always slacks and kind of muted colors. I don't know. I kind of thought I didn't really want to stand out. And when it started getting to the point where to get my point across, I was starting to interrupt people and kind of acting like a lot of the guys around me. Then I stopped and said, no, this is not who I am. And then I started embracing my authentic self and feeling comfortable in my own skin that I could show up, and came out as a woman and started dressing, with suits and dresses and things like that, still very professionally. And then it was very huge sense of relief that I could be myself. I can be myself and still be effective. I don't need to look like one of the guys. I don't need to speak like one of the guys in order to get my job done. And people reacted really well to that. But I did start with that initial feeling that I could only have been successful if I had assimilated, if I had sort of fit in. But luckily, after a few years, I figured out that, you have to be yourself. Otherwise, it's a game. You're just always, trying to be somebody who you're not. And that weighs on you.
You mentioned the clothing. For me, it was the clothing was one. So always sort of the muted dark colors. And the other thing, and so for women in the audience in particular, the hair. So, 8-10 years ago, I would have never worn my hair out this big, because you were so focused on what other people are thinking that you're not actually focusing on the work. And I think that's the reason why it's so important to show up authentically, is because you want to bring value and you want to bring the conversation forward, right? And if you're so focused on, fitting in or making sure that you look like so-and-so, or that you're not sort of standing out, then you're sort of losing and wasting time doing all of that other stuff and not really committing to what's at play and why you're there. And so the clothing piece really reminded me of myself, right? Like I said, it wasn't just that long ago where I was willing to let my curly hair be curly and just embrace that.
And you probably heard the term covering, right?
Oh yeah, definitely.
It takes energy to be covering a part of you, and that energy is taking away from how you could, be even more focused on your job. So don't waste that energy trying to cover. I think just show up as yourself.
Yeah, and I will say, not that anybody here, like in terms of advice, right? If you're wasting things, if you feel like you actually have to cover and you think and reflect and stop and say, actually, this place only lets me cover and doesn't accept me for who I am, then I would argue that's not the place you want to be.
Thank you. Michael, what are your thoughts?
So I have two different thoughts because first of all, as I said earlier, I think the gender dynamics in the workplace are really powerful and distinct in some respects from the broader. I think they're related, but I think that women face still, regrettably, just incredible challenges that, those of us who are not women have a huge responsibility to be allies and to be, I enjoy these conversations because it helps me understand better how to be a more supportive colleague. I want to talk about two issues. One about, to your question, Sid, about the word assimilation and what that means, because I think in the corporate context, it's very different than I think in the cultural context that we use it at large. And then I also want to come back and talk about covering up who you are in a very different context. On the assimilation point, I agree with everything that's been said, but I think it's also so much of what's hard about being different and being a person of color or a person of a different background is it requires a very heightened degree of emotional intelligence, I think. There are a lot of smart people in the world. Not everybody has EQ as strong as their IQ. And EQ requires being able to read not just a room, but to understand the context of the institution that you're joining. So, for example, when I joined the board of trustees at Stanford, that's a very old, august, very kind of rarefied board. Half of them are billionaires. It's just not like your typical board. When I joined the Edison board, it's a 150-year-old corporation. I mean, there are companies and organizations and boards have a culture. And I think if you arrive hell-bent on not adapting, which is and learning how to navigate and swim effectively in that culture, I think you're going to be in for a lot of pain and not a terribly effective experience. And so sometimes assimilation can have a negative concept because it means denying who you are, but I don't see it that way. I see it more as you've got to learn the environment. You've got to understand where your colleagues are coming from. This is especially important in the board context where collegiality in a corporate board is really important because directors have to get along even when there are important differences. And I just think it's important to really have the emotional intelligence to understand who your colleagues are, where they're coming from, what the culture of the institution is, and then learn to adapt your distinctive life experience and your lived experience and your diversity to that environment. Adapt not in the sense of giving up who you are, but learning how best to move it along and influence it. And there are times that there are different ways to do that, and I think it really varies greatly by the individual. But I don't want to kind of create this impression that, in the corporate context at least, adopting, assimilating, acculturating to the corporate culture means giving up your identity, because I don't think it's always the case. I think my co-panelists have identified some examples where it is negative, but it's not always so. And I think kind of going into a situation as a grenade thrower, I think can be very counterproductive, not just to you personally, but to the causes of diversity that you support. So it's just knowing where to push and where to, apply your voice. On the issue of covering, so I'm openly gay, and I've had many times early in my career where I would show up not as my complete self. And I had a deep fear that if I was ever discovered, and I always remind people, this is pre-will and grace. I'm in my 50s. This is, not that it's easy being today for everybody, but times have changed significantly. This is pre-equality, pre-marriage, pre-everything. And people can still be fired for being gay in some parts of the country. And back then it was even more of a risk. At the time that I was coming up in my firm, there were no openly gay partners in the firm, except in the San Francisco office where there were one or two. And that was kind of like a given because it was San Francisco. And I felt very concerned that if I came out, I could adversely affect my chances of making partner. And I ultimately did come out as I think a third or fourth year associate, but it was a journey. And I guess I would say that even in that context, I had been in the firm sufficiently long to establish myself and my relationships and to let people get to know me. And then as I came out, I found that I was able to be an even more effective mentor to other closeted, soon to come out openly gay associates. And I could also reach some of my partners who maybe some of them were dealing with this issue for the very first time in terms of really up close and personal. And I think I was able to reach them more effectively because they had known me as a lawyer and they had seen me in that context. So these are really difficult issues. And I know that there's always a risk that anything one says on these topics can be misinterpreted. And I certainly hope that's not the case. But I think it's really important to understand that it's an individual journey. You be yourself to the best of your ability. If as a woman you feel in the early years you need to, cover in order to establish your bona fides, and as an openly gay person, not everyone always feels comfortable being out in the first instance. I mean, those are personal choices that one makes, and there are different, approaches. But I do think it's important to say there's not a one size fits all, and that we each just have to approach these issues authentically.
Well, Michael, thank you so much for sharing that because it's actually a perfect segue to my next question. Because you're sharing your experience of being Latino and openly gay, and this brings me to my question about your full authenticity when you have multiple intersectionalities. Last year, I'm very proud that ASED was the first organization to actually do Afro-Latino webinars for those who are in corporate America, and that had never happened before. And when we did it last summer after the George Floyd situation, a lot of companies came out and said, our employees are saying we're not talking about this enough. And so, I think building on this, Michael, and I guess I'm going to start with Isaura, and then maybe Michael, if you want to talk more. But and of course, Marisol, being you're Afro-Latina, and talk about how do you bring your full authentic self when you do have intersectionalities that often make you maybe bring your Latino side out, but other sides might take longer. So we'll start with you, Isaura.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Intersectionality, I was reflecting on that as Michael was speaking, that there's been times in my career that I don't disclose everything about me because I'm afraid of how that may impact some of the people around me. And let me give you an example. So I'm a mother of 3 adult children, all in the STEM careers. I'm terribly proud of them. So I'm very proud to be a mother. But I don't always disclose that. That's not my first opening, part of how I introduce myself. Because in the corporate context, there are some people still very old school that assume that someone that has a family is not as flexible to travel and to take on stretch assignments and such. There was a time as an early executive when my company was discussing opening a new site in a different city. And the executive spoke to everybody on the team except me. And that conversation was, we're going to be opening at a new site. I want to offer you the opportunity to take a leadership role. Will you move with us if we move to the city? When I realized that he hadn't spoken to me, he immediately said, oh, well, you have a family. I assumed that you wouldn't move, that you wouldn't be able to, relocate. And obviously had a conversation with him right away and told him that that would be my choice, that I would still prefer to have been given the opportunity to make that choice. I don't think he ever would make that kind of a mistake again. But the fact that he assumed because I was a mother and because I was raising a family that I would not have the interest to go to another city and start at the site, sort of, brought up that intersection of motherhood and career professional can sometimes, in the wrong situations, be a limiter. So you are always evaluating, how much of myself do I'll always share. There's times where I'm, very, very happy to share that I'm a mother and how my kids are doing. So there's different parts that you have to kind of think of the relevance and how will this really help you in terms of your storytelling. You know, there are times where I disclose that I'm first generation because as a first generation person in the United States, understanding what it's like to learn how to speak English or to have people make assumptions. There's an example where one time we were faced on a project that required advanced math skills, and the project was assumed that the technicians that we had wouldn't be able to understand it, so they weren't given the opportunity to apply these math skills. When I challenged that assumption, I said, I think we can teach the individuals this new spec. We implemented this very successfully. And in the first year, we saved our company $100 million by allowing us to get a lot more product on a wafer by using decimal points in our design. Just that part of my background helped me see that people were making unfair assumptions. And so I disclosed that, and I think building trust with the team to make that change. So my point is really there are times where you do bring parts of yourself forward and times where you might not, depending on the situation.
Yeah, thanks, Isaura. Marisol, I'm going to go to you. You know, you're Afro-Latina.
I am every single day.
you know, as Isaura and Michael shared, you know, their intersectionalities. How do you bring your full authentic self as an Afro-Latina at a major financial institution? Internally and externally.
Yeah, and so here's what I'll say to that. It's really interesting because, and I don't know how it is at other organizations, but at least at JPMorgan, right, when you self-ID, you self-ID either as Latina or as Black or African American or Afro Caribbean in some instances, right? And so I actually have to, every year, what I do is I have to choose, and it is and it's a struggle, and you know it's one that's it's personal to me because I am sort of being forced to choose my identity, and I show up, and when I try to show up every single day as me, I'm already being limited, and so I actually make a conscious choice to sort of put that aside and really focus on me and what it is that I want to bring across. It is a personal challenge, I will say, like as I noted, because you know, when I am talking to the Latino population, you know, they'll see me one way perhaps. When I'm talking to my Black colleagues, they'll see me another way perhaps. When I'm talking to a majority white audience, right, they don't know what they see many times, right? And so it's incumbent upon me to show up as myself. And I actually make it a point to every single time I'm speaking on a panel at work, internally or externally, one of the first things you'll hear me say is I announce it. You know, I don't hide it. I can't, you know, skin color and all. And so I say I am a Black Latina. I'm a first generation. And that's what it sets the tone for me. And that is how I show up. That is how I bring that in, regardless of where I am, right? Internally, externally, big rooms, small rooms, because it's really important, sort of back to the theme of this conversation, right? To really show up as you, because you don't know who else is there, and they're learning from you, and or they'll have some takeaways from you. And so you really want to give yourself and those around you, all of you, to the extent that you can, and hope that it's a welcoming environment. But Sid, like I think, you know, like I said, it is a challenge, and it is one that I have to think about pretty often and regularly, to be able to still show up authentically in these circles.
Well, I appreciate you know, all of your feedbacks on this. You know, we are in Pride Month, and Michael, I really appreciate you know, you really sharing you know, your experiences, and of course you know, Marisol and Isaura, this is great. Here's one question that that sometimes comes up, and I know this has been an experience for me. And Michael, you kind of touched a little bit about this. but the difference between bringing your authenticity when you're the only one in these meetings internally at your company or externally at other meetings. And of course, Michael, I know you're CEO of this, but for you, it might be a different external ones. But but what's is there a difference in terms of how you bring your full authentic self between when it's internally at their companies or externally? Why don't we start? I'll start with Isaura, and then we'll go with Michael, and then.
Yeah, interestingly, I think when you are representing your company, you are the other. We're talking about in your own company how sometimes you might feel like the other, but when you are out representing your company, you're the other. So you are the representative of your company, and that's the first thing that matters. Is, are you representing your company well? Can you guide people in terms of technical decisions or the sale, et cetera? And so that becomes sort of the leading part of what people experience and what I believe my role is when I'm representing my company, as opposed to when I'm in the company and it's internal, then we all belong to the same company. And then some of how we are different and how we all bring different things to the table is more likely to come up. So my experience has actually been very favorable when I'm externally in a role, because people see you first as the representative of the company.
Great, thank you. Michael.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, I'm Latino. My last name is Camuñez. There's no concealing who I am, and I've never tried. To the contrary, I've from the earliest days of my career, I've insisted that the Enye be used when my last name is spelled. I remember I arrived as a first-year associate at my law firm, and they had my nameplate on the door, and it was Camunez, but no Enye. And I politely called the office manager and said, I'm sorry, but my name is misspelled. Do you think I could have a new nameplate? And she came by and she's like, what's the problem? Is it not? And I said, no, it's actually a different letter. And she was very embarrassed. And of course they replaced it. And from that moment I started, that. But that said, I mean, so I want to approach this from two different contexts. From, with respect to being openly gay and Latino, just as an example, I'm on the nominating and governance committee of Edison International, and we were going through our proxy statement where the company discloses all the directors are put up for a vote by the shareholders and elected annually at the annual shareholder meeting. And I noticed that, like most publicly traded companies, they have sort of board qualifications, and there's sometimes these graphics that will show you, like, we have directors that represent so many African-American, so many diverse categories and so many skill sets. And I noticed that there was not an LGBT category. And I asked, why don't we report that? And there was a whole bunch of, very legitimate privacy issues and other things. I said, but I'm out. And why wouldn't we? So we did acknowledge it. And what I found out, because I was contacted by a reporter who saw our proxy statement, and it prompted her to do some research, because if you go to the Edison International proxy statement, you'll see that we report our directors as by multiple statuses, including LGBTQ, et cetera. And this reporter told me that I was the first director in the Russell 2000, the first independent director. So the CEO of Apple is openly gay. There are openly gay CEOs who are inside directors, but the first independent director that was reported on a proxy statement as being openly gay. And she wanted to know what was the story behind that. And I said, there's no story. The story is we're proud of who we are, and I'm proud of who I am. And I thought it was important to send a message that this board embraces diversity in all of its kind. So in that sense, I've been very public, and I've tried to take steps not to hide and to affirmatively conceal. Excuse me. That said, I also work in the international context, and I spend a lot of time in Latin America. And I will be honest, I wouldn't be honest if I said otherwise. In my business, sometimes I don't go out of my way to disclose my sexual orientation. I speak Spanish fluently. I'll be in conversations with high-level executives or government officials, And I will never lie about who I am, but I don't always immediately disclose my sexual orientation because, again, as I said earlier, you have to understand, you have to read the context, you have to read the environment. And most often I'm representing a client or an interest, the company that I'm on the board of. And if I think that my personal identity is going to create an issue potentially for the company or for my client, I don't disclose it. It's not important enough to me. I'm not there to make a political statement. So again, I say it's an individual journey. People do it differently. But that's been in part how I've reconciled the two and how I try my best, to be authentically who I am, not to conceal it. It doesn't take 5 minutes of searching to find out about me and my family on the internet. But at the same time, I'm not necessarily leaning in, as somebody said earlier, on that particular issue in every context, because I know that in certain parts of Latin America, there's still a lot of homophobia, and it may not be in my client's interest or my company's interest to do that. So it's a personal choice.
Well, thanks for sharing that, Michael. And that's quite game changing in terms of like being the first to be disclosing a proxy statement. So really our congrats to you for really being a leader in this. Marisol, any internally at JPMorgan Chase, externally when you're out, is there do you feel that there's a difference in terms of how you bring out your authenticity between internal and external meetings?
I don't know that so much internal, external meetings, but there is a comfort level with people that you know. And so I think there is a little bit more of an ease in certain circles, right? Like, so at, my leadership team table within the legal department, perhaps I'm much more open and vocal and fluid just because there's a comfort level there, and folks have a trust in me, and so I trust in them. I think that perhaps I equate maybe other parts of the bank or another part of the business the same approach as externally. I may sort of be thinking about it just a little bit more thoughtfully rather than sort of just blah blah blah. Here I am. But for the most part, I think generally it's not so much about whether it's internal or external for me. And sort of in my role and my position, it's more about, is there some kind of comfort level and trust and shared understanding, more so than the internal, external for me personally.
All right, thanks. So I know we have a couple of questions from the attendees. I know I will not get all of them. We have a lot of questions. So here's a question, and actually this one question here is actually from Jessica Ruiz. If any of you look back, would you have been 100% authentic from the very beginning? I'll open it up there, but we'll try to get as many of these questions in.
I don't really understand the premise of the question, I guess, because I don't feel I've been inauthentic. I think and again, I think vocabulary matters.
Yeah.
I think I haven't always disclosed every part of my identity. And it sounds like that's common to, some of us on the panel, but I don't think I've been inauthentic. So I think that, the times have changed. I mean, would I have been more forward leaning about coming out sooner? Maybe, but I also did it in a way that was comfortable for me. So as I say, I think it's just a very personal choice. On the Latino issues, the ethnicity issues, I've always been very authentic about who I am, about my lived experience. I've always been very communicative about my life and my experience and my life experience and the way that influences, the way language influences things. So I don't really feel that I would have done anything differently.
Well, thanks, Michael. Anyone else want to chime in?
Yeah, I think that it's very similar to Michael. People did try at the very beginning my name Isaura is very difficult in corporate America. And people try to, do you have a nickname? Can we call you Izzy? And I'm like, no, my name is Isaura. Think of it as a combination of Isabella and Laura. Try your best. And, I wouldn't bend on certain things that to me were very important. But again, there are different outlets too. So at the very beginning of my career, when I was, trying to fit in as an engineer, I also had my external professional life, Hispanic Society of Hispanic Professional Engineers, where I could be totally my authentic self. And I really treasured being, having that available after work. And, that's kind of helped me to reconcile that it wasn't just me kind of going through these experiences. A lot of my colleagues face that as well. But yeah, I think there's, as Michael described, different amount of disclosure you do in different situations. But I've never lied or hid if somebody asked me about myself.
Okay. Let me. I'll try to get through some questions, and then some of you, just anyone, feel free to chime in on some of these ones. But one is with all the social justice issues that have come to the forefront over the last 18 months, has your position, affected how you respond to these issues, either at work, and I'll paraphrase, like either at work or in meetings where you are the only one in the, where you may be the only one in the room or one of the few in the room, or the roles that may have played when helping the company respond when they're looking to you because you may be the only one that can help them, guide them through these kinds of external issues. Well, and I'll paraphrase, say it could be social justice issues, but it could be anything external that is impacting either Latinos, people of color, and any examples like that. Anyone want to chime in on that?
I'll take a stab at it, Sid. I think I will say yes. I think I've taken, last year we had a lot of obviously social unrest. I took this role back in July of last year, so it's close to a year. So I actually looked at it as perfect timing for me to sort of influence the way I wanted. And I felt we needed to be as a department and as a firm. And so I have used my position to sort of really voice the voices of the unheard, right? And making sure that that's represented. And I have been really focused on that. And really creating intentionality around that because it is so important. And so I've embraced it. I have embraced being the only, and so we recently, whether it's the elections, right, and sort of the insurrection on January 6th, and sort of commenting around that. It's about voting. It's about creating opportunities for our API communities and sort of making sure that they're feeling safe, right? Every single time there's an issue that comes, I do try in measured ways and in a different context to make sure that those voices are heard and represented, and have tried to use my current role to push that forward.
Sid, I might just add, from my own experience, and again, this might be somewhat controversial, but one of the things I noticed in the aftermath of the George Floyd murder was that both in corporate America and in NGOs, nonprofits, foundations across the country, everyone was kind of rushing to figure out what to do to respond to the Black Lives Matter movement. And I was personally very supportive of it. And I've always believed that the African-American experience, the Black experience in America is historically very distinctive and merits special attention. But I was concerned that there was a tendency, as we often do in American history, to see the world through black and white lenses and to forget that there are a lot of other people who've suffered from systemic racism and discrimination and oppression, including Latinos. And coming from the Southwest part of the country in particular, where we have horrendous stories historically of the mistreatment, the murder, and the deprivation of civil rights for Latinos. I've tried to make sure that we don't simplify the discussion down to simple black and white issues, and that we do all we can to honor the Black Lives Matter movement in and of itself, but to also understand that that movement represents not just justice for African Americans or Black people, but justice for everybody. Including, and that's not the same as saying all lives matter, but that there are many people, including Latinos, who have suffered historical systemic discrimination. And it's even led, to be very honest with you, to some uncomfortable conversations with some colleagues. But I feel it's important, because if I'm the only Latino in the room and important decisions are being made about, resource allocation or other things, I think I'd be falling down on the job if I didn't mention it. And I guess this to me, I think I'm in a place in my life and professionally where I can do that now, and I can take those chances, and I'm willing at least to be unpopular because I feel secure in my own place. I don't know that I would have always felt that way, but I think that's one of the benefits that comes with age and wisdom and experience, is that you begin to realize life is short, and you're there. You got to make good use of the time that you have. But I would say, specifically in response to that question, I think I've carried a lot of water for broader communities than just the Latino community, but on those points specifically.
Well, thank you. I'm gonna. We got about 2 minutes, so I'm gonna try to get this one last question in, and that is, do you feel, or have you been given the responsibility of teaching others to be more inclusive? And how have you dealt with that feeling, or of being that kind of situation? In other words, you're the only one in the room, and now they're coming to you saying, "Hey, what's going on with Latinos?" or what's, or anything else that's taking place, and you feel like, how have you dealt with those, with those kinds of situations?
Maybe I'll take a stab at it. I think leading by example is really important, and showing yourself as an inclusive leader is a way to really set the tone, role model to others in terms of how to really listen, let people be their authentic selves, embrace difference and celebrate it, and bring it into the mix of how we design products. Role modeling is really important. Now, you don't want to be labeled as, okay, you're Latina, let's hear your perspective. But I think starting with the point of, I have a perspective to share, I have an approach, I would be willing to share that with you. And it's been very, very helpful in terms of role modeling inclusiveness.
Thanks, Tara. Anyone else? All right. Well, actually, that's good. So we're we're right at the 20 past the hour. So that's give me the cue. Well, let me just say that this is great, and I know that our attendees really appreciated this session, because I can tell you, going into our morning, this was a common theme that we heard from a lot of our attendees of our corporate leaders, and even those that are on boards, or those that are trying to get on their first board. So this is very great. So again, I want to just give my thanks to Isaura Gaeta from Intel, the Honorable Michael Camuñez, CEO of Monarch Global Strategies, and of course Marisol Rubecindo from JPMorgan Chase & Company. Thank you so much for just a very insightful topic about authentic leadership when you're the only one in the room. And I think that I hope everyone in the audience just really heard their wisdom, and just know that when you are the only one in the room, don't be silent. Make yourself present and show that you belong, because you do belong. And so with that, I want to pass it over to Eric Lopez, our Ascent Director of Corporate Accountability, and who will take us to what our plans are in terms of networking for the rest of the day. So, Eric Lopez. All right, back to you.
Thank you, Sid, Isaura, Marisol, and Michael, for an empowering look at authentic leadership for Hispanics.